It's the Newsmaker Show with Brian O'Neill on AM 1480 WLEA, where Brian Kilmeade is coming up at 9.
Good morning, it's Derek Belinsky filling in for Brian O'Neill on another edition of the Newsmaker Show. Joining me today is Gary Ostower, a professor at Alfred University. Good morning, Gary. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning to you.
Gary, I believe you're a history professor at Alfred University?
I've been a history professor here for a long, long time, going back to the 19th century.
And were you a mayor of Alfred at one point?
Yeah, I was. I'm a politician. I guess that makes me a political insider.
And just to clarify, I believe I covered your son, Peter, in my past profession.
Well, you probably did, as a matter of fact. Pete was involved in 5 different sports at Alfred Ammon when he was a student. One of the nice things about going to a school where you only have about 50 kids in a graduating class, maybe only 25 of them male, so he probably had a good deal of exposure in the Hornell Tribune, and he also wrote for the Hornell Tribune for a short time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, we'll talk a little bit about politics today, and obviously it's the primary in Pennsylvania as well as 4 other states. What are your predictions as we grow closer to the polls in Pennsylvania opening?
Well, I better warn you, and I've said this on WLEA before when I've been interviewed. Back in the 1990s, for 4 consecutive years, I predicted that the Buffalo Bills would win a Super Bowl. And for 4 consecutive years, I was wrong. And that's about what I would say generally about my predictions. So people shouldn't take this too very seriously. But, what's going to happen in Pennsylvania? I guess I'm a slave to all of the polls that have been showing that Donald Trump is going to do very well. The most recent poll seems to show that he has about a 50% share of the voting population there, that is those who are going to vote in the Republican primary, and that Ted Cruz has a somewhat lesser number. I think that Trump is ahead by, if I'm not mistaken, something along the lines of 14 points or so, and then Kasich a few points behind Trump, behind Cruz. So, yeah, I would be very, very surprised if Trump does not win. But what's going to happen in July in Cleveland, that's another story. I mean, I think that you probably heard as recently as yesterday that Cruz and Kasich, Trump's 2 opponents, are now, quote, colluding, or at least, trying to cooperate in such a way as to block Trump from getting a majority on the first ballot at the Republican convention. And if they are successful in that, then I think all bets are off, because I really don't think that Donald Trump can win an election. I don't think he can win at the convention if he doesn't win on the first ballot. I think there's so much fear of him in the Republican Party, so much opposition by, especially by really, really wealthy Republicans, that they'll find another candidate, whether it's Cruz or whether it's Kasich or whether it's someone else, maybe a general like Stanley McChrystal, or maybe someone like Bob Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, in both a Republican but also in a Democratic administration. As I say, all bets are off.
So what you'd be saying is that he would come up short of that 1237, I guess it's delegates that needed to receive that nomination?
That's correct. I think there's a reasonable chance that he will come in short. And let me give you one reason why I say that. Yeah, Trump clearly, I think, is going to win the majority of votes in Pennsylvania today. There's no reason at this point to think that by tomorrow morning, we'll be hearing anything other than a very, very substantial Trump victory. But of the Pennsylvania delegates, the vast majority, if I'm not mistaken, all but 17 of the delegates, and there are about, I think, 90 delegates altogether, all but 17 are how shall I put it? They are uncommitted. In other words, regardless of who you vote for as a primary voter, these delegates are free to vote for whoever they want. And I may have the numbers wrong. Maybe it's 57 of them are uncommitted. But a very, very substantial number of that Pennsylvania delegation is uncommitted. If they don't want to vote for Trump, even though Trump gets the majority in the primary today, If they don't want to vote for him at the convention, they are free to vote for anyone else whom they want.
So then if Trump did not receive that nomination, do you believe he would run as the third-party candidate?
Good question. I mean, that really is that's the million-dollar question at this point. Or maybe Trump would like to say the $3 billion question at this point. Would he run as a third-party candidate? It's too late to get onto the ballot in many states. But it's not too late to get onto the ballot in some states. And if he got on the ballot in some states, he certainly could take enough votes, draw enough votes away from whoever the Republican candidate is to virtually guarantee that a Democratic candidate, whether it's Hillary or whether it's Bernie Sanders, to guarantee that the Democrat will win the election. So I think that, he has a very, very powerful instrument, so to speak, in respect to, his control over this process. So let's say that he needs the 1237, and let's say he has 1175 at the beginning of the convention. What I was saying is that he's not going to win, okay, that they're going to find another candidate. But he will threaten, almost surely threaten, to leave to run as a third-party candidate. And if he does that, I think there may be enough Republican senators and enough Republican congressmen who will fear that they may be brought down, that they may lose their own election in light of, a third-party Trump candidacy. If that happens, then I think that, maybe Trump is going to, that he really will win that election. And, I'm talking about third-party, you raise the issue of a third-party candidate. There are third-party candidates, many of them, who have gone nowhere. Maybe they get 1% of the vote, maybe 2 or 3% of the vote, maybe even less than that. There are vegetarian candidates. There are communist candidates. There are all kinds of, strange third-party candidates in American history. But every so often, there's a third-party candidate who really does make a difference in a campaign. And the best example I would offer is about 100 years ago, back in the year 1912, when Teddy Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate, when the Republican convention in that year did not make him the Republican candidate. And in the general election, he received more votes than did the regular Republican candidate, who happened to be the sitting president of the United States. His name was William Howard Taft. And by splitting the Republican vote, the Democrats won the election. Woodrow Wilson became the president in 1912. Could that sort of thing happen in the year 2016? The answer is yes.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit and, shift over to the Democratic side. And kind of Gordon Deal put me on the spot last week with Bernie Sanders. And I was surprised to find out one of his platforms is offering free college. What do you make of that and his platform or his campaign strategy?
Well, it's interesting that you raise the issue of free college. I teach at a university that is certainly, I teach at not only a university, but a private university, which charges, substantial tuition to students who are going there, although I must say at Alfred University, a large percentage of our students get scholarships so that the actual cost of tuition at Alfred University is about the same as it would be at any of the state institutions, whether it's Alfred State or Geneseo or, Binghamton. But, regardless of that, it's attractive. Kids are coming out of college today. Students are graduating from college with $20,000 in debt, $40,000 in debt, occasionally $100,000 or $120,000 in debt. And that is scary, especially in an environment where, with an economy a little bit edgy, as it has been since 2008, students are not at all confident that they're going to have a job. So I think that Bernie Sanders is surprisingly popular on college campuses. I had a student who wrote a research paper for me, and he was writing about someone back in history, actually back in the 16th century, and he compared him to, of all people, Bernie Sanders. Why? Because this fellow back in the 16th century, I'm talking about Martin Luther, was kind of a rebel, okay? He challenged the establishment. He challenged the, existing institutions. Well, that's exactly what this student liked about Bernie Sanders. So needless to say, I kind of talked to my students about that, And what I discovered is that at Alfred University, as when universities all over the United States, Bernie Sanders is wildly popular. Now, whether or not he can actually, do as the president what he claims that he's going to do is hard to know. But, certainly there is popularity. So, what do I think about his program? I think some of it is unrealistic. The effect, for instance, if you have free tuition at all public universities, the effect on private universities may be devastating. Maybe half of the private universities in the United States will have to close. By the same token, he wants to expand Medicare. He wants to establish a single-payer program, a health program, universal, that is to say, to cover all Americans, similar to the kind of program they have in Canada or in France or in Denmark or in Norway. On one level, it's attractive. On another level, one has to question, is it feasible? Can we afford it? And even if we can afford it, would a Republican Congress, a Senate that is controlled by the Republicans, as well as a House of Representatives, would they cooperate? Would they pass something like that? I think the answer is absolutely not.
Joining us today on the Newsmaker show is Gary Ostower, history professor at Alfred University. Gary, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but in my reading, I found out that Sanders is kind of a democratic socialist. Can you kind of define that, especially when it comes to Sanders?
Yeah, I think I can. And I should preface my comment by saying that there's a real, Americans tend to confuse a democratic socialist, any kind of a socialist, with a communist. And there's a huge, huge difference. What we usually mean by the communists are those who would have followed a political program that involved, among other things, dictatorial rule, similar to the kind of thing that you had in the old Soviet Union before it collapsed in 1991. There's a political program that is often very, very anti-democratic. A democratic socialist is, in fact, with that small d, highly democratic. I lived in Denmark for a number of months. Back in 2005, I had a Fulbright grant. I was a lecturer over there. Well, at the time, in fact, to this day, they had a socialist government. There was more freedom, more personal freedom in Denmark than there was in, I would argue, in the United States, for that matter, in respect to the kind of thing that libertarians in the U.S. rather enjoy. But in contrast to the libertarians, there was a good deal of governmental involvement in such things as providing universal health care. In Denmark, the one time I had to see a doctor, I walked into a doctor's office, I gave them my Social Security number, and that was the last I ever heard of a bill. I never received a bill, never had to even talk about expense. By the same token, in Denmark, if you go into kindergarten, you go into a state-run school, and if you go to a college, you go to a state-run college, and you never pay a cent in tuition. So, for obvious reasons, that may be rather attractive, especially to a relatively young population. In Denmark, there were social programs that guaranteed housing for everyone, unless you didn't want that housing. So they had a few homeless people, but they were homeless by choice, which may not make much sense to us as Americans, but was certainly the case over there. And I think also that there's less likely to be support for corporations. Bernie Sanders, of course, continually complains about the fact that 20 Americans in the top, I don't know what percentage it would be, but the 20 wealthiest Americans have more money, they have more wealth, they control more wealth than 150 million Americans in the bottom half of our income scale. Well, presumably what a democratic socialist would do would be to tax the very, very wealthy a good deal more than they are taxed right now. For instance, might tax them as much as they were taxed during the Eisenhower years, when Eisenhower was president during the 1950s. During those years, the wealthiest Americans, at least theoretically, paid about 90% of their income in taxes.
Gary, I'm going to ask you to press
In fact,
pause.
we did not.
Gary, I'm going to ask you to press pause for a second. We need to take a quick commercial break, pay some bills, and do the weather. We'll be right back on the Newsmaker show after this break. We are back on the Newsmaker show, 1480 AM. I am Derek Belinsky filling in for Brian O'Neill. With us today is Gary Ostower. Gary, I apologize for cutting you off. We'll finish up with the definition of a democratic...
Of a democratic socialist.
Yes, and Bernie Sanders before we start in on a little bit of Hillary.
Well, I guess the way I would conclude my comments about democratic socialism is that, in pure Marxist doctrine, the government would own all of the industries. There would be no private property, literally. Karl Marx calls for the abolition of private property. A democratic socialist would not call for the abolition of private property, and where you have them in government, as you have had them, for instance, in Germany and France, certainly in Norway and virtually all the Scandinavian countries, it's a cooperative arrangement. You have capitalism, but you also have expanded social programs. They had in Denmark a joke that they used to tell, and the joke went this way, that in Denmark, 90% of the people are taxed to support the other 90% of the people. And I think that gets it just about right. Everyone enjoyed those social programs. Interestingly, even the conservatives supported the national health plan that the socialists had established in Denmark.
Now, in my research last week and watching some TV a week ago, Hillary took, I believe it was 71% of the female votes in Steuben County. And interestingly enough, you point out, people may or may not vote for her or against her because of her being a female. What do you make of all that?
My guess is that, and I would have answered this very differently 20 or 30 years ago if I had been asked a question like that. There are probably perhaps 10% of the population that would not vote for her because she's a female. But I also think there's probably 10% of the population that will vote for her only because she's a female. And to that extent, if I'm right, it kind of evens itself out. I think that the gender, the issue of sex, means a lot less today than it did even just a decade ago or 2 decades ago. What I'm finding, again, in the college area is that many of the younger women who are inclined to vote will vote for Bernie Sanders. And the older women, people over the age of perhaps 40, female, will vote for Hillary Clinton. So there's no question, I think, that the issue of sex will have some bearing, but is it conclusive? Is it the main factor that's going to determine their vote? That's kind of up in the air.
A lot has been made of Hillary's email scandal, if you will, and her, quote-unquote, maybe dishonesty. Do you believe she's as dishonest as the media may make her out to be?
No, I really don't, and it's kind of interesting because I'm not, enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton. But there's a website, a very, very good website, run by a Tampa, Florida newspaper. The website is called PolitiFact.com. And what PolitiFact.com is to take many comments. This is nonpartisan. Taking comments made by all of these candidates and checking the veracity of these of the comments. Okay, how truthful, in other words, are these candidates? And I found I guess I wasn't completely surprised, but I was somewhat surprised. The least honest of the candidates is Donald Trump. About 75% of what he says turns out not to be true. That's astounding, I think. Ted Cruz, pretty close. About 70% of what he has said turns out not to be true. For instance, when Ted Cruz claimed, during the campaign a few weeks ago that Marco Rubio had disrespected the Bible, that was just untrue. When Ted Cruz's campaign put together a fake photo of Marco Rubio and President Obama, that's dirty pool. That's hitting under the belt. On the other hand, what most surprised me is that Hillary Clinton, who I thought would be well up there, only about 25% of her comments were either untrue or partly untrue. And Bernie Sanders was the most honest of the bunch. Okay, about 20% of his comments were found to be untrue or partly true. But the two Republican candidates, the two leading Republican candidates, turned out to be much less truthful than the two Democratic candidates. And I think that most of us are going to probably hear a good deal more about that in the event that you have a Hillary Clinton-Donald Trump campaign.
Looking at that Hillary Clinton-Donald Trump campaign for president, going back to last week and perhaps even to tonight, do you feel that these primaries will be a momentum swing or a turning point in either of their campaigns?
Hard to say. If Trump doesn't get the nomination, I think we as historians are going to say that the turning point was the Wisconsin primary, not what happens today. In that sense, I wouldn't place too much emphasis on Pennsylvania or Rhode Island or Connecticut or whatever. But if he does get the nomination, we're not going to talk about a turning point. So we historians are kind of patient when it comes to making these judgments. On the Democratic side, I don't think there's any way that Bernie Sanders can get the nomination. I think he remains in the race not to get the nomination, but to influence the character of the Democratic platform when the convention meets. But again, I think we'll have to see about that. What I do find interesting about the recent developments is that, again, going back to yesterday, there are these claims that Cruz and Kasich will cooperate to block Trump from getting that first ballot nomination. Trump calls that collusion, which has a negative sound to it. As a historian, I would argue that it's cooperation, and it's the kind of things that politicians have done all the time, but occasionally not to their own benefit. And let me give you again, if I may, a historical example. I'm going all the way back to 1824. In an election when Andy Jackson, running for president, he was a popular general. He had won the Battle of New Orleans for the Americans against the British. He won the popular vote. But the guy who got the second largest number of votes, and the guy who got the third largest, the one who got second was John Quincy Adams. The third was a fellow by the name of a Kentucky senator by the name of Henry Clay. They got together. They they combined their electoral votes so that not Jackson, but Adams became the president, and then the payoff was that Henry Clay became the Secretary of State. Well, Jackson was furious, and by golly, the American public was furious. And consequently, when Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams 4 years later, Jackson won decisively. So sometimes you pay a long-term price for this kind of, quote, collusion, end quote.
Gary, we got about a minute left. Throw out some names who you see as a potential vice presidential, running mates for either Clinton or Trump.
If Trump wins the nomination, I think he's going to ask Joe Scarborough from Morning Joe, MSNBC, to be his running mate. Scarborough is a former congressman from Florida, conservative, and he has been very, very kind to Trump in respect to giving him airtime, and he knows a lot about politics. On the Democratic side, I think that Hillary Clinton is probably going to ask Tim Kaine, who is a somewhat moderate, somewhat conservative senator from the state of Virginia.
That was Gary Ostower on this morning's Newsmaker show. I'm Derek Belinsky. We'll see you right back here in 23 and a half hours. Have a good day, everybody.